I remember the evening I first met Emily. I always liked how her name sounded, short, yet with a soft and tremulous note, almost untouchable. At the time, I was in my second year of college in Minneapolis, but I had come to Washington for the weekend to visit my best friend, Brandon. He'd moved there after high school, got a part-time job at a small art cafe, and kept inviting me to visit, promising unforgettable parties. I'd chip in for gas money just to spend a little time in the city and take a break from my studies, and one day, after Brandon finished his shift, we met her. The whole group was gathering toward the end of the day at Hudson's Corner, a pub where it was always loud and people chatted boisterously while sipping from tall glasses. Waitresses in aprons carried around beers and cocktails to the clink of dishes. I sat at a wooden table, drumming my fingers on its slightly sticky surface, trying to make out pieces of the buzzing chatter around me. Somewhere nearby, a forgotten rock ballad was playing through the speakers when I saw Emily walk between the tables, as though all the attention in the room belonged only to her. Her light brown hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she had the kind of smile that could melt the lingering chill of winter, even in February. At that moment, I felt there was something magnetic, almost hypnotic, in the way she smiled, and I froze, staring at her so intently that Brandon playfully smacked the back of my head to bring me back to reality. She came over to our table, hugging her friend Sarah around the shoulders. Sarah was chattering away about something, but I barely heard her words. I was captivated by the smooth turn of Emily's head, the way she bit her lip when she listened to someone's conversation, and that mysterious downward glance whenever she laughed. Then she looked at me and said, "You're Brandon's friend, right, Matthew?" I jerked slightly, trying to compose myself so I wouldn't look like a total fool. We exchanged a few words, and her voice struck me even harder, soft, slightly husky, imbued with some inner confidence. I'm sure, from the outside, it looked like I'd suddenly forgotten how to breathe. If not for the smell of hot cheese and French fries drifting over from the next table, I might have lost touch with reality altogether. Later, it all felt like a fast-forwarded scene in a TV show. Emily laughed at my jokes. I told her funny childhood stories. Brandon tried to insert his ironic commentary to tease both of us. We exchanged numbers, and all evening I caught myself thinking, is she real, or am I dreaming? When we finally said goodbye, I could hardly believe she'd agreed to go out on a date with me the following week. It felt almost too good to be true. From that point on, we saw each other more and more, and soon our dates turned into something more serious. I stayed in town longer, sometimes skipping a couple of morning lectures so I could have breakfast with her again. We spent evenings walking along the waterfront or sitting on a bench in the park, which by day hosted street musicians, and at night was filled only with the stars and the faint glow of street lamps. Emily seemed like the kind of person who fit seamlessly into any space. She was equally at ease in noisy clubs or secluded nooks filled only by breeze and cool air. Her openness was disarming, and I liked that she talked about herself without embarrassment while still keeping some mystery. I knew I didn't know everything about her yet, but I saw no reason to worry. Maybe I was too sure that people we trust would never act against us. Our relationship took off like a spring flood rushing toward the ocean. I thought we were alike, that we had something in common. She was bold, fearless, willing to take risks, and I felt a strong urge to build a life with this free-spirited soul. We started hanging out with the same circle of friends, sharing drinks at the bar, talking about our dreams and plans. Brandon teased me, saying I was now taking over his city because of a girl. But jokes aside, he was happy for me. We rarely brought up the past, although we each had our skeletons in the closet. I felt there was no point digging into what was gone because we were so happy in the here and now. I can't say I was the perfect boyfriend. I always felt I had my weaknesses, that I couldn't always give someone everything they deserved. But I tried. I gave her flowers, arranged little surprises, recorded silly voice messages for her. That spring, I spent more time traveling between Minneapolis and Washington than on my own campus, and everyone around me started joking that I might transfer colleges for love. I just laughed. Maybe I will. And soon enough, I did switch to part-time enrollment, all to be closer to her. That decision created a stark contrast between my old and new life. I left behind the friends I'd grown close to in college and plunged into a world where new priorities reigned. My plans with Emily, our shared apartment, and the need to work side jobs just to make ends meet. We rented a small place on the outskirts of town, not far from a local park with a lake. The morning view was amazing. The sun rose over the water, painting orange-red reflections on its surface. Every time I saw it, I thought my life was finally on the right track. Even though it was hard, we were running through money fast, and there was almost no time to rest. It's amazing how quickly people get used to happiness. I, for one, was ready to believe everything was going as it should. Sure, routine gradually crept into our daily life because we both had jobs. Emily found a job at a design company, drawing advertising banners and interior layouts, while I worked part-time in a computer store, doing freelance projects in the evenings. We didn't see each other as much as in the very beginning, but we still tried to plan little romantic evenings sometimes, lighting candles and making pizza or pasta. The memories of those moments still fill me with a bittersweet nostalgia. I recall Emily quietly humming while she wrapped cheese in the dough, and I'd stare at her, mesmerized, thinking that all I wanted was to spend my whole life like this. Naive as it sounds. We got closer, as people do when they live together. All the little details came together in a mosaic. Habits, quirks, small joys and big dreams, annoyances and complaints. Sometimes I noticed Emily would come home more pensive than usual or send long messages during dinner, saying it was work-related. I didn't give it much thought, figuring this was normal in adult life, balancing personal time, relationship time, and your job. But sometimes a faint shadow of doubt would flicker inside me, like shapes on a wall in the weak light of a street lamp. I dismissed it as small anxieties of someone who was experiencing adult obligations for the first time. I didn't want to be controlling or jealous. The idea that something might be wrong seemed ridiculous. I believed these stories of betrayal and infidelity only happened far away, not in my life. The only thing that really shook me was Emily's sudden disappearances on weekends. She'd say she was going out of town with her colleagues for some on-site project, something to do with a private event design, and then be gone all day. She'd come back late at night, when I was already in bed. Often, she'd return in a good mood, and I could detect a faint scent of perfume that wasn't hers. She'd explain that she worked side by side with a new coworker who had brought a bunch of samples for advertisements and helped set everything up quickly. I felt a pang of unease because she lit up noticeably when she spoke about him, but I kept telling myself every girl in a relationship has some male colleague at some point, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything. I persuaded myself there was no need to suspect her without evidence, because this was the person I trusted most in the world. That lasted until the morning everything changed, a moment so painfully clear in my memory. That day, I woke up before she did and decided to make breakfast, hot dogs in a Mexican style with spices, jalapenos and sauce, trying to surprise her because she adored experimental foods. We had only one laptop between the two of us, which I'd propped against my hip while cooking, checking recipes online. All of a sudden, a notification popped up from her email, apparently because I hadn't switched users. The subject line read, "Conference photos. Great time together." I wouldn't have thought much of it, but habit led my eyes to skim the screen, and when I clicked the email to see the attachments, thinking they might be photos from a work trip, what I opened left no doubt as to what was really happening. These were clearly not business photos. In that moment, I felt something sharp punch me in the gut, knocking the breath out of me. Shaking, I scrolled through the pictures. In some of them, there he was, that coworker, Daniel, if I recall correctly, a tall, stocky guy pressing against Emily, smiling at her while she gazed back with infatuation. In other photos, they were sitting on a hotel bed, making silly faces, but their closeness was undeniable. Inside, I felt everything flip upside down. Admiration, trust, everything I believed was the solid ground of our relationship seemed to crumble. I stood at the stove, hearing the sausages sizzle in the hot skillet, while my mind frantically searched for any plausible explanation. Maybe it was a joke? Maybe they were harmless photos? Maybe I didn't understand their office culture? But the email's text made it clear they'd had an amazing weekend and an unforgettable night, hinting at plenty of intimate details between the lines. Honestly, I couldn't bring myself to finish reading. I threw up right into the sink. I didn't even realize what was happening. My body just reacted to the shock. When Emily came out of the bedroom, drawn by the commotion, I stood clinging to the kitchen counter, pale, ready to explode from anger and heartbreak. She asked if I was okay, seeing I was in terrible shape. I couldn't speak. I wanted to scream, to smash the laptop against the wall, but I was paralyzed. I think she guessed what had happened. My face must have said it all. Her first words, "It's not what you think, let me explain," just fanned the flames. All I heard in her voice was the fear of being caught and the realization that everything was revealed. I no longer clung to any illusions. She started telling me in a broken voice that it just happened, that they'd worked together on a project. It was only once. Then she paused and corrected herself. Twice. I listened, as if underwater, hearing only muffled sounds. I wanted to disappear, not to hear that revolting confession where every syllable felt like a stab to the heart. I realized that everything we had, our whole love, our story, our nights wrapped in each other's arms, were all turned to dust. Part of me still wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, but seeing her tear-filled eyes, I understood she didn't regret it in the way I'd hoped. She was just terrified it had come to light, not truly remorseful for the act itself. We started yelling at each other. I couldn't stop. I was spewing every word that came to mind, determined to hurt her, as if that would help me. Shouts of, "I trusted you," and "How could you," blended into a single torrent of accusations. She kept insisting she loved me, that it was a mistake, but in the way she avoided meeting my gaze, I could see she didn't grasp how deeply she'd hurt me. There are times in your life when you feel the fundamental pillars of your world cracking. That was exactly what I felt. And it was all happening in our tiny kitchen, with sausages sizzling in the background and the acrid smell of burning bread. I couldn't stand her presence anymore. It felt like the walls would collapse if I didn't get outside and catch my breath. I grabbed my jacket and stormed out of the apartment, leaving her standing there. Outside, it was damp and drizzling, and the street lights felt painfully bright. My heart was pounding so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. I sat on a bench next to the building and stared at the gray sky, where not a single star was visible. The raindrops mixed with my tears as an internal struggle raged between wanting to go back to confront her until I ran out of words and wanting to run away, anywhere I wouldn't have to see her face or hear her excuses. I must have sat there for over an hour, feeling myself freeze, my damp jacket clinging to my skin. My thoughts were in chaos. No logic left. Part of me wanted to go back inside and get every bit of the truth. Another part just wanted to vanish, so I wouldn't be reminded of the betrayal and the devastation of realizing that everything I'd planned for my future was now uncertain. We had so many dreams. A shared car, a vacation at the ocean, talking about getting a dog someday. Now all of it seemed absurd, almost laughable. When I finally forced myself back into the apartment, Emily was sitting on the floor, slumped against the wall, her eyes blank. She was crying. The kitchen still smelled like burnt food she apparently hadn't touched. Or maybe she'd tried, but just couldn't focus on clearing it out. I didn't know where to start or what to say. I saw her tear-streaked cheeks, and my pain mixed with pity. Perhaps I still loved her in that moment, but the heartbreak was too intense. Then a new, more horrible thought flashed in my mind. What if this wasn't the first time? What if there were others before? That realization cut me sharper than a razor. When I finally found my voice, it was strained, hollow. I demanded an explanation. No excuses, only the truth. She sobbed, repeated that it wouldn't happen again, that it was a stupid mistake, but we both knew nothing would ever be the same. Once trust dies, it can't be resurrected by a simple, "I'm sorry." I think she understood that too, but desperately tried to deny the obvious. I had no idea how we'd move on. All the images of our shared life flashed before my eyes. Our first kiss, her voice when she sang with a guitar by the lake, our private little jokes. Every tender memory was scorched by the knowledge of her betrayal. But this wasn't a movie where the hero slams the door and starts a new life. We were entangled in each other's existence, our apartment, finances, families, friends who saw us as the perfect couple. I knew it wouldn't end just like that. We argued until dawn, mostly shouting and crying rather than talking. Every time she tried to touch my hand, I recoiled in disgust mixed with heartbreak. Finally, I asked her, "Do you love him?" and saw her freeze for a split second. "No, of course not," she said, but I couldn't find it in me to believe her. Because if she truly loved me, would she have done this? Would she have risked everything we had? I found out she had continued to see him at work. He'd been attentive, and she couldn't resist. Hearing that made my stomach churn with every possible emotion. I couldn't bear to ask any more questions. My heart squeezed at the thought that on those days she told me she was working late, she might have been with him. My mind tried to rationalize. Maybe she wasn't getting what she needed from me. Maybe we lost the spark. But none of these excuses justified her actions. Cheating isn't just a slip-up, it's a deliberate choice. I couldn't find forgiveness in me. Eventually, morning came and we had to decide something. We couldn't just exist in the apartment with these shattered feelings. Emily went to take a shower. I threw some essential items into a bag and told her I was going to stay with Brandon. She looked at me with the face of someone who realizes it's the end of the story we'd been writing together. I shut the door behind me, feeling like a part of me had been ripped out. The worst part was how incongruous it felt. How could the person I saw as my closest, most beloved companion become the cause of such agony? That was when I truly understood what it meant to feel alone. I felt like I'd been ejected from the comfortable normalcy of life with no warning. Everything had changed in a single moment, and now I couldn't look at a sunrise, something we used to admire together, without feeling hollow and lost. Worst of all, the place I had called home just yesterday became tainted by lies and betrayal. On the way to Brandon's, I had to pull over multiple times because I was trembling so badly. My thoughts were racing, and a lump in my throat made it hard to breathe. I parked near gas stations, just sitting there, watching people pass by, munching on hot dogs, talking on their phones, oblivious that my world was falling apart. I felt ashamed for my weakness. Aren't men supposed to be strong and stoic? But what kind of stoicism can you have when the woman you loved more than life itself has betrayed you? When I finally got to Brandon's place, I hovered at the door, unsure whether to ring the bell. I wasn't sure I wanted to tell him everything right away. What if I regret telling him? But I did ring, and when Brandon opened the door and saw my expression, he immediately understood something terrible had happened. He hugged me, letting me feel safe, and beckoned me inside. In his small living room, there was always a mess. Piles of clothes in one corner, pizza boxes on the table, and a stack of music CDs on the windowsill. But this time it gave me a sense of comfort, a place where the pain didn't feel quite so crushing. At first I couldn't speak. I just collapsed onto the couch, crying. I don't recall the last time I had cried in front of anyone, but tears poured out as Brandon patiently waited for me to calm down. He didn't pepper me with questions or demands, just let me release what was bursting inside. He probably realized that was the only way for me to begin processing what had happened. Once I was a bit calmer, we went to the kitchen. He put the kettle on, and we found a pack of cheap instant noodles. He suggested we eat something, knowing I probably hadn't had a proper meal. Over the kitchen table, I told him everything, each word so painful, as if I were reliving it. I saw Brandon's jaw tighten with anger. He clenched his fists, muttering curses under his breath, outraged that Emily, someone he liked and trusted, would do that to me. He'd seen us together, shared our happiness, and now felt outraged on my behalf. God, what the hell? How could she do that? He blurted, pushing aside his mug of tea with only a couple of sips taken. I shrugged. I have no idea. I never would have guessed. People can hide all sorts of things, I guess. We spent hours discussing whether there was any chance to fix it, or if I should just walk away. I honestly didn't know what to do. Part of me hated her, yet another part feared living without her. Brandon is straightforward, so he said, if you can't trust her anymore, how can you stay together? Love is one thing, but living in constant suspicion is something else. His words stuck in my head, because I knew trust is the cornerstone of any relationship. Once it cracks, everything collapses. I stayed with him for a couple of days. I tried not to think about what Emily might be doing back in our apartment, but thoughts crept in. Is she crying, waiting for me to come home, or has she already gone to him? Those questions tore me apart. Brandon tried cheering me up, inviting me to parties and introducing me to people, insisting, "Don't wall yourself in, you've got to breathe freely, keep going." We went out a couple of times and I tried to socialize, to act interested. But inside I was still in that apartment, replaying the same horrifying discovery of those photos, or the memory of her eyes as she confessed. After a couple of days she called me. I hesitated for a moment before picking up, but then I did. Her voice was quiet. She was probably crying. She said, "Matt, please, we have to talk. I can't take this anymore." I could almost feel her desperation. But I was still burning with anger. I snapped, "Is there anything left to say after what you did?" and felt a wave of guilt for the harshness in my tone because I heard how broken she sounded. Even so, I agreed to come by so we could talk things through. I needed closure. I couldn't go on in limbo. When I got to our apartment, it looked like a tornado had swept through it. Clothes were strewn everywhere, boxes and things scattered, as if she'd tried to pack up and then changed her mind. The smell of burnt food still lingered, and the sink was piled with dirty dishes. Emily was at the table, staring blankly. When she saw me, she jumped up as if she wanted to hug me, but I stepped away. I sat down across from her, saying, "Talk." She launched into a monologue, claiming she'd been racked with guilt, that her fling with Daniel had been a stupid attraction, that she was drawn in by novelty and excitement, but now she realized how badly she'd messed up. She begged for forgiveness, promising she would do anything to make it up to me. "I'll do whatever it takes. Just give me a chance," she said through tears. I watched her, trying to detect insincerity in her words. But even if she was entirely sincere, I didn't know if I could continue living under the same roof with someone who had betrayed me so deeply and hadn't had the courage to address any issues between us before it was too late. I answered sharply, "You realize I can't just pretend nothing happened?" She nodded repeatedly. "Yes, I know." And I realized that word "no" meant different things for both of us. Maybe she hoped the wound would heal over time, that we could patch things up and move on. But for me, her betrayal had destroyed not only my trust but also my sense of us. I told her so, seeing how her desperation turned to frustration. "Well, what do I do then? Tell me how to fix it," she said almost hysterically. But I had no answer. I could have said get out of my life, but for some reason, I couldn't. Maybe a part of me still wished for a miracle, while another part understood miracles don't happen. The rest of the evening passed in an endless cycle of blame, painful memories of happier times, and attempts to find some thread that might save our relationship. I caught myself imagining that her infidelity was just a dream, some bizarre fantasy. But the truth was right in front of me. She'd been with someone else, and probably more than once. The exact number no longer mattered. The real blow was knowing she'd chosen to betray me, a deliberate act that shattered my sense of security. When night fell, we were exhausted. We hadn't made any decisions. I slept on the couch while she stayed in the bedroom. We felt like strangers living under the same roof. Lying there, I listened to her footsteps, hearing her stifled sobs. Part of me wondered if we could try to fix things. Maybe people do forgive betrayal sometimes. Could we do it too? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how little faith I had that I could ever live without suspicion or hatred lurking in my heart. Yes, people do manage to forgive, but I wasn't sure I had that strength. If trust is the cornerstone, ours was now rubble. In the morning, I told her I couldn't stay in that apartment. It felt like the walls themselves were tainted with lies. "I'm leaving. I need time to think. Don't call me. I'll contact you when I'm ready." She just nodded, her eyes filled with hopelessness. I grabbed a few more belongings, locked the door, and walked out without looking back. I knew if I turned around, it would rip me apart even more. I couldn't handle seeing her face, the face I still loved yet that had just broken me. Back at Brandon's, he gave me a knowing nod when he opened the door. "Stay here as long as you need. I get how rough this is," he said. In that moment, I felt immense gratitude for a friend who asks no more questions, gives no unsolicited advice, and simply provides space to grieve. I felt betrayal, disappointment, and emptiness. My thoughts circled around the images in those photos, her confession, and fleeting fantasies of revenge. By night, I couldn't sleep, replaying the entire story in my mind. Brandon tried to get me out of the house, introduced me to his buddies, encouraged me not to get stuck. One night, we came back a little buzzed, and he offered, "Maybe you should just get it out of your system. Sleep with someone else, distract yourself." But for all my heartbreak, I couldn't do that. I felt no spark of interest toward anyone else. All my energy was consumed by the situation at hand. My mind kept going over and over it. Was this a one-time mistake or evidence of who she really was? Did I want to try to forgive her? Could I ever trust again? Ultimately, I knew I had to choose. I couldn't live in this indefinite limbo forever. But one thing was clear. Even if I decided to forgive her, I'd never be the same person. I'd have to rebuild everything from the ground up, stifling my jealousy and suspicions at every turn. Did I want that life? Or was it better to end it and start over alone? Those questions gnawed at me like acid. I kept remembering her eyes during that final night in our apartment, when we were physically so close, yet worlds apart. That was the state I was in when I unexpectedly got a message from Daniel. Yes, the same guy from the photos. The mere thought of him still sparked a wave of jealousy and rage. I had no clue how he got my number. Maybe Emily gave it to him before everything fell apart, or he found me on social media. But in his text, he said he needed to talk, that he didn't want to leave things like this. I read his words, feeling the anger burn all over again. What did he expect? That we'd calmly sit down and have a dialogue? The idea seemed absurd and humiliating. Yet, deep down, I was still trapped in chaos, and any information that might shed light on the situation felt valuable. Maybe hearing his side would help me make a final decision. I didn't reply immediately. I was too upset. But after a couple of days, he messaged again, practically begging me to meet in some neutral place. I pictured us in a cafe, him, the man who took my place in Emily's bed, and me, the fool who hadn't even seen it coming. It sounded surreal. But in the end, I agreed. We arranged to meet on a quiet street at a small coffee shop that wasn't too busy on weeknights. When I arrived, he was already sitting in a corner, clutching a paper cup of coffee. He looked miserable, definitely not like a winner in any sense, more like someone who knew he'd done something awful and didn't know how to fix it. He looked up, saw me, and gave a slight nod, inviting me to sit. I was on edge, fighting to keep my breathing steady. I had no idea what to expect, an apology, an explanation, an attempt at justification. Part of me still saw him as the source of my pain, but at the same time, I was surprised I didn't want to punch him right there. I sat down and just said, "Well?" not adding anything else. He fumbled for words, clearly worried I'd cut him off. He told me he'd learned about me from Emily, that he knew she was living with someone, but things just happened between them, that they both lost their heads at work, that they found they had similar interests. I was listening, thinking, what nonsense, no mutual hobby justifies betrayal. But I stayed quiet because I wanted the full story. He repeated multiple times that he hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that Emily told him there were problems in our relationship, and that he didn't have genuine feelings for her. He was just caught up in the moment. Emily had told me something similar, but I wondered why he'd called me now. So I asked, "Seriously, what do you want from me?" He stammered out that he realized he'd trespassed in someone else's life and needed to say it to my face because he felt like a scumbag. Then he poured out a jumble of words about how he wasn't trying to steal Emily away from me, how everything was over on his side, that he knew he'd acted horribly. I listened and felt conflicting emotions. I believed he might truly regret it, but the memory of those photos where he and Emily looked happy together wouldn't leave my mind. Part of me could see he was sincere, but another part was furious. I asked if he'd seen her after the truth came out. He lowered his eyes and said no, but admitted she'd called him a couple of times. Why? I demanded, and he confessed he wasn't sure. Maybe she wanted to clarify their status, or was afraid the workplace scandal might blow up, so she was trying to handle it, or maybe she wondered if I might confront him. Hearing that, I felt a new wave of revulsion. While I was reeling between despair and hope, she'd been making arrangements behind my back. He added quickly that nothing else had happened since, and that he wanted to end it all. I realized he was seeking some kind of forgiveness, maybe so he could look at himself in the mirror with less guilt. But for me, that changed nothing. I stood up and said I didn't know why he thought I'd want to hear all this. His remorse might help him feel better, but for me, my life was still broken. He pleaded with me to stay and listen, so I remained standing, hands in my pockets, regretting I'd come at all. He finished by offering to back up my story with any proof I needed, explaining what really happened. If you need me to show anyone evidence or clarify what went down, I'll do it, he said, for your friends or your parents or... I shook my head. Do you think anyone else's opinion matters to me? I've lost trust in the person who lived with me. How is that going to help? He went quiet, guilt written on his face. I could see he wanted some kind of absolution, and I had none to give. It didn't matter whether he was a schemer or just a fool. They broke my faith together. I turned to leave. As I reached the door, he said softly, "You know, Emily really is torn up about this. I cut him off, shouting, "Don't you dare talk about her feelings." People at nearby tables looked over, startled. Anger surged in me again. Part of me wanted to know more about her sadness, but my pride and fury wouldn't let me. I slammed the door behind me. Outside, the air was cool, and the slight wind felt liberating. I walked off into the night without a clear destination, just putting distance between me and that cafe. Eventually, I found myself in the park where Emily and I used to stroll. I remembered that springtime scene, the bare branches budding green, us laughing, skipping rocks into the water, me feeling like the happiest guy in the world. Now I was there again, feeling empty and bitter. My thoughts churned as I wondered if I should pack up and leave everything behind, but the memories would follow me wherever I went. I had an onslaught of conflicting feelings. Some about revenge, some about heartbreak, some about wanting to vanish. At some point, exhausted, I hailed a cab to Brandon's place. Through the taxi window, I watched the city lights blur in the drizzle, faintly thinking I might need a therapist. My moods, swinging between fury and numbness, were beginning to scare me. When I got home, Brandon was out, probably still at work or visiting the girl he'd started dating. I was alone, and his cluttered living room felt oppressive in the lamplight. Discarded pizza boxes, half-empty glasses. I sank into his armchair, noticing my bag of clothes in the corner. A wave of bleakness settled over me. I was temporarily crashing at my friend's place, with no real home of my own. That morning, I called my old college to see if I could come back full-time instead of part-time, even though it might set me back academically and financially. I learned there was a possibility. It would require an extension of my studies. But maybe it was better than stagnating here in this turmoil. I never liked sudden changes, but my life had been turned upside down anyway. After the call, I wandered the streets, trying to distract myself. I bought a newspaper to check for rental ads, dropped by the library to bury myself in a random book. But my mind kept drifting to Emily, her voice, her tears, how she pleaded for another chance. Over and over, I asked myself, what if she really has realized how much she messed up? People do make dreadful mistakes in relationships. Is that something I could forgive if I truly believed she'd do anything to fix it? But just thinking about it made me quake with anger and fear. Could I ever look at her again without seeing them together? While on this pointless walk, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was Emily's mom. My heart jumped. We'd always gotten along well. She even called me sweet boy on special occasions. I had no idea why she was calling, but I picked up. Her voice was quiet and gentle, and she said she knew what had happened, that Emily had confessed everything and was miserable, begging her mom not to see her as a monster. I listened, my face probably revealing my turmoil. She made a terrible mistake, her mom said, and I'm not trying to justify her. But I can see she's hurting, and I can see you're hurting too. A bitter laugh escaped me. Yes, it hurts. I never dreamed this would happen. She sighed. I know it doesn't mean she doesn't love you. I know my daughter, and she's holding on to the hope that you'll forgive her. But I also understand you have no obligation to do so. All I ask is that you figure out what you really want, and not make a rash decision you'll regret. I looked at her, feeling that she was being completely sincere. She wasn't preaching or trying to manipulate me. She was just asking me to remember that Emily was human, after all. If you can't forgive her, I'll accept that. Just don't do it out of pride. Follow your heart, she said gently, and I thought, my heart is exactly what's broken right now. I wanted to tell her it wasn't about pride, it was about the destruction of trust, but I couldn't form the words. She invited me to stay for lunch, but I politely declined. I felt too out of place. Standing to leave, I murmured, "Thank you for trying to understand us. I just don't see a way out." She offered a sad smile. "There's always a way out. It's just a matter of which way is best for you." We said goodbye, and I stepped out into the street, feeling another weight of uncertainty in my chest. I'd always believed that when someone cheats, you cut them off. But now that I was in this situation, I realized how complicated it was. This wasn't a fling or a casual date. It was the person I lived with and planned a future with. Memories and hopes didn't vanish overnight. Later that night, I got a call from Emily's dad, his voice cooler and more formal. "Matthew, I won't beat around the bush. I know the situation. You know how I feel about infidelity. I don't condone it. But I'd still like to speak to you man to man. I need to know what to expect." I tensed up. I'd always been intimidated by him. He was more rigid, known to make people uncomfortable with a few blunt words. Yet I could sense no hostility from him, just a determination to get things straight. We met at a bar, though I'd have agreed to any setting if it spared me another visit to their home. He wore his usual suit and tie, a serious expression, shoulders squared like an executive. I immediately felt guarded. I ordered a soda, not wanting alcohol. He had coffee and studied me for a moment. "I'm sure you realize I'm not going to excuse Emily's actions," he began. "But I need to know if you're planning to stay with her or not. You know our families. I saw you took good care of her, and I was hoping you two would get married someday." There was no added, "or I'll gut you," which I half expected, but the tension remained thick. I laid out my confusion, how lost I felt, how I wasn't sure I could forgive her or trust her again, or whether we could ever go back to what we were. He nodded, quietly saying, "I understand. I wouldn't be sure either." He took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and admitted he couldn't understand why his daughter would do this to someone who, in his eyes, treated her so well. "You know our family has a strict view on cheating," he added. "I could just say, she doesn't deserve you, forget her. But I want you to decide for yourself. Because if you do forgive her someday, I don't want my words hanging between you." I sat in silence, flooded with conflicting emotions. Part of me was almost offended by his calling me buddy, while acknowledging I had every right to leave his daughter. But I also understood he was offering me freedom and acceptance if that was what I chose. It was probably the best he could do, given the circumstances. We fell quiet again until he asked, "If you two have children in a year, will you be able to live without constantly suspecting her? Could you be a good father if you're still carrying this resentment?" That hit me hard. I imagined myself co-parenting with her in the future, having to cooperate, share responsibilities, act like everything was fine. My stomach twisted. It seemed unbearable. We parted with me saying I needed more time. He shook my hand, holding it a bit longer than usual as if to say, "I genuinely feel for you." Outside, it started to drizzle, and I wandered off, my mind buzzing from the weight of these talks with her parents. Both had essentially said, "Don't rush, but it's up to you," while neither claimed that everything would be okay, and I realized they themselves were torn. This was their daughter, whom they loved, but they couldn't erase the betrayal or fix my pain. The rain picked up as I walked, soaking me to the bone. The gray sky above mirrored my mood, the cold drizzle dripping down my collar. It felt almost good, as if the rain was washing away my despair more effectively than tears could, clearing my head enough to think. And one question dominated all others. Do I want to give Emily a chance? I kept revisiting a mental list of pros and cons. On the pro side, all our shared moments, her smile, her understanding, our closeness, our inside jokes, the earnest conversations at night. On the con side, the betrayal, the way she'd looked when she admitted her second time sleeping with him, the way she'd pleaded with me to stay. Most of all, the con was my broken heart. Any love that remained felt overshadowed by her betrayal. That evening, I returned to Brandon's place, and for the first time, we had a direct talk about my plans. He asked, "So what's next? Maybe you can move in here full-time if you don't want to go back?" I knew it was a generous offer, but I also knew I couldn't crash with him forever. And he'd recently started seeing someone, and I didn't want to be in the way. I told him I was thinking about returning to my college in Minneapolis, but I hadn't decided. He nodded. "You've got to do what's best for you. Not because Emily wants it, not because of your pride, but because it's your life. And you're the one who has to live with the consequences." Hearing that spoken out loud jolted me. I'd been focusing too much on what everyone else wanted. Her parents, my friend, even Emily's feelings. I hadn't genuinely asked myself what I needed. Maybe leaving was really best. I'd get away from places that triggered these memories. But I knew memories live in your head, not just in a city. That meant I wouldn't find real peace unless I confronted her directly, one last time, to ask the hard questions. So far, our communication had been angry tears and denial, not an honest conversation about whether she was genuinely willing to fight for us. Would that conversation help or just reopen wounds? Maybe I'd simply confirm there was nothing left to save. But if I didn't try, I'd always wonder, what if? So late that night, once Brandon fell asleep, I stepped onto his small balcony, phone in hand, and called Emily. I nearly hung up, but then she answered. She sounded drowsy, likely already in bed. Without preamble, I told her I wanted to meet somewhere neutral for a real talk. No more screaming, no more tears that drowned out facts. She exhaled like a burden had been lifted and agreed right away. I didn't want to meet at our apartment or at hers, so she suggested a small out-of-town hotel with a quiet cafe where we'd been once. She probably thought it best to avoid crowds and the risk of running into friends. Yes, the idea of a hotel was odd, given the circumstances and my own paranoia that it would remind me of her affair. But it was indeed a discreet spot with few visitors. I agreed. After I hung up, I felt my heart pounding. I realized I was about to face my pain again, but it was necessary, like a surgery that must be done so the wound can begin healing. A faint hope flickered inside me. Maybe if we laid it all out, I could decide whether to give her another shot or walk away for good. At least it might free me from the suffocating indecision. Lying awake on Brandon's couch, I stared at the ceiling, memories flashing in my mind. Daniel's remorseful eyes, her mother's gentle empathy, her father's firm but fair stance, and Emily herself, once my beloved partner, and now the person who had brought me to this anguish. Suddenly, fear gripped me. What if no matter what she says, I still can't believe her, and everything ends here? But living like this, unsure and stuck, was impossible. I'd made my choice to talk it out, for better or worse. I had no idea how it would end, but I understood if there was any chance for us, it lay in open dialogue. If not, maybe it would at least give me the closure I so desperately needed. With that thought, I finally fell into a restless sleep, holding on to the hope that our meeting would shed some light on whether we had any chance to continue as a couple, or whether our story, once so full of promise, had truly reached its end.